Sleepless. Written by Richard Parry. Narrated by Richard Parry. The Texas. The deck thrummed, more feeling than sound. Jennifer felt it in her teeth. It was a harsh sensation, like using a mechanical toothbrush with a thrown bearing. She'd had one of those in basic, the fluffy end finally breaking off mid-clean and leaving her with coffee breath. It had been going on for 3 days. Or close enough anyway. It didn't seem to matter anymore. She'd stopped counting the days so precisely when McConnelly was found nailed to his bunk. That might have been yesterday. If it was the day before, well, the thrumming had been going on for 4 days. Hard to tell. McConnelly. Now, that was a thing. It hadn't looked accidental in any way. No, sir. No one was trying to make his death look like some random act of fate. That would be easy around here. You could get cycled out an airlock, or caught up in the induction coils for the gate drives. Accidents happened all the time. No, this was definitely deliberate. Big industrial bolts had been fired through his limbs and into the metal sheeting that supported the bunk. The damnedest thing was the look on his face. He'd been smiling. She'd done the post-mortem herself, tox screens showing clear. He hadn't been drugged, which probably meant he was aware of the rivets being driven through his arms and legs. Running her hand through her hair, she did the mental math. How many sleep cycles had she missed? How many meals on the mess deck? Her eyes wandered to her console, papers and reports scattered on top. Empty packets of stims lay amongst dirty coffee bulbs. Okay, so probably 4 days. Jennifer watched a pencil on the corner of her console. It shivered in sympathy with the deck plates, occasionally giving a tiny jump. The end of the pencil was chewed, teeth marks up and down the shaft. She could still make out some faded lettering, once proudly proclaiming a Staedtler product in bright gold. The evening after McConnelly's death, they'd found Monroe. He was in the mess hall, quite dead, a small pool of blood around his mouth. He'd managed to eat an entire teapot, including the small porcelain lid. He'd had to break bits of it up to get it all down, the jagged ends doing some nasty internal damage. He'd bled out internally through his stomach. She had collected all the teapot's pieces into an evidence jar in her office. After putting them back into some semblance of order, she saw the pot had a Winnie the Pooh motif on the outside. Perhaps it was a gift from one of his kids, or for his kids. It didn't matter much now. He'd also been smiling, clearly not feeling the indigestion that had killed him. If Jennifer had been asked to describe the expression, she would have said, dreamy. It had gone on like that, crew members dying around her. Some appeared murdered, like McConnelly, and others appeared to have developed habits that killed them, like Monroe. It didn't really matter how it happened, but they all died smiling. The closest thing to tie it all together was the damn thrumming that went through the ship, shaking bolts loose, weakening pressure seals, and worst of all, giving Jennifer a headache she couldn't get away from. The pain and the stims kept her awake. 4 days. It was enough to make anyone depressed. It's just that they all looked so happy dead. The alarm shrieked, causing her to jump in her armchair. The red emergency lighting spun shadows and confusion around her cabin. At least the noise was a distraction from the thrumming, giving her something to focus on. Jennifer got to her feet, armchair rolling back on its casters. She was unsteady at first, her hip bumping into the console, knocking papers to the floor. The pencil jumped, hit the floor, and rolled under the console. She'd get it later, maybe after some sleep. She grabbed another stim pack from her locker, popping the top and sucking back the sickly, sweet fluid. After a few moments, the grittiness in her eyes seemed to lift, and she could focus on things again. The text on the stim pack announced another fine Pharmac product and encouraged her not to exceed 2 units between sleep cycles. The shaking in her hands didn't stop. She tossed the empty pack to her bunk and shrugged on a shirt from the pile on the floor. It was clean enough for an alarm. No sleep today. Jennifer wasn't going to sleep until this was all squared away. Heck, she could sleep when she was dead, either way. Facing the door to her cabin, she pushed her shoulders back and crammed her cap on. Time to act like an officer. She opened the door, heading down the narrow passage, boots clanking against the deck grating. She nodded at the sentry posted at the end of the corridor. "Fenson, report!" Fenson came to attention, her right arm snapping up to salute. Career soldier, as near as made any difference. She'd enlisted fresh out of Port Amber, right from the front lines of the conflict. Jennifer noticed the crisp lines of Fenson's uniform. She was probably sleeping better than Jennifer if she still had patience to iron.
"Ma'am?" "Yes, ma'am. Fire alarm started seconds ago. We think it's from inside the morgue."
Jennifer eyed Fenson from under her cap.
"You think, Private?" "Ma'am."
She cleared her throat.
"Rupert is going to take a look." "Alone?" "Ma'am, there's no one left. There's no one else."
"Private, follow me." Without looking to see if Fenson was following, Jennifer broke into a jog towards the morgue. A fire in the morgue would be highly unusual. There wasn't anything in there to burn. She could hear boots behind her. Fenson. Good. As they got closer to the morgue, Jennifer could smell the smoke. It was oily, like too much fat on barbecued bacon. She could also hear a sound, strangely rhythmic. As a child, her mother had wanted her to play an instrument. Jennifer was having none of it, preferring to play outside with her brothers. After much reflection in the music store, she'd chosen the clarinet because the sound of a poorly blown reed was sure to drive her mother crazy and end practice very quickly. This sound had that same high-pitched edge to it, a shriek starting to build from some terrible pain, and then stopping again. Jennifer rounded the corner leading to the morgue and saw Rupert standing in the doorway to the morgue. He wasn't moving, his face registering shock. The smoke was thick here, black, sooty clouds coming from the door to the morgue. She could tell from where she stood that tears were streaming down his face, from shock or the smoke. It was hard to tell. Same song, different music. She'd seen a man like that in the field once, watching as the enemy had started eating one of his squad mates just before being topped himself. Regardless of why, Rupert was stunned, immobile, and ineffective. Jennifer grabbed an extinguisher from the wall and ran up beside him to look into the morgue. The Texas carried all kinds of supplies. It was a big starship designed to spend years on a mission. All the comforts of home, right here in space. They even had recorded TV shows, all reruns, but something at least to lean against in the cold of space. Feeding a hungry crew was vital, and the needs of the kitchen were paramount. A well-fed crew was a crew marginally less inclined to mutiny. So they had the usual: powdered eggs, flour, all kinds of proteins and frozen vegetables, stacks of them down in the hold. Heck, they made cakes on Christmas. For that, they needed the usual supplies. And sugar. Big barrels of sugar. One of those barrels had been wrestled up here into the morgue. The top popped off. Jennifer guessed some kind of incendiary had been used to start the fire. Probably a welding torch. And then, by the looks, only a quick glance so far, Specialist Wallace Simpson had thrown himself on top of the blaze. He was making the noise. There wasn't much left of his face, and probably not his throat either. He just sat in the fire, not moving at all, the smoke pouring off him in big black clouds. His orange jumpsuit was charred, a long taffy streamer of melting plastic stretching down from his thigh. Jennifer pushed past Rupert, bringing the extinguisher up. She squeezed the release, great gouts of white foam hitting Simpson's torso. The flames guttered down while she played the extinguisher over him and the barrel of sugar. Stepping forward quickly, she planted a boot in Simpson's chest and pushed him backwards out of the path of the flames. His body hit the floor, soot and flakes of something, better not think about it, puffing out from his back. She continued to play the stream of foam over him until she was sure he was no longer on fire. The sugar barrel was still on fire, though. She grabbed a surgical tray, tossing medical tools across the room, and pushed it over the top of the barrel. Starved of oxygen, the fire would go out quickly. Jennifer dropped the extinguisher on the tray, then turned to Rupert. "Private! Report!" Rupert seemed to notice her for the first time. "Soldier!" "Ma'am." Rupert seemed to come out of a shock then, body coming back to attention. "I arrived here just before you. Specialist." He cleared his throat. "Specialist Simpson was already... He was... The barrel... Jennifer scuffed something off the boot she'd pushed Simpson back with. "Go on." Rupert tried again. "Specialist Simpson was in the barrel. No. On the barrel. In? I think he was on the barrel. The barrel was on fire." He looked down at his feet. "I didn't see anyone else in here, ma'am." Nodding, Jennifer turned to Fenson. "Get a medical crew down." "Christ!" It was Rupert. The shot rang out, harsh and loud in the metal cage of the morgue. Jennifer spun back to him, taking in his unholstered sidearm. "Fucking Christ!" He fired again. Simpson sagged back down, all the air going out of his ruined lungs in one final breath. "Dude!" Fenson's voice was strained. "You just shot Simpson." "He was dead. He couldn't have still been alive. The fire!" Jennifer looked at Rupert. "Private, surrender your weapon." Rupert's face turned desperate. "I had no choice." It was coming for us. Fenson spoke again.
Listen to the boss, Rupert. She knows what she's doing.
Rupert's eyes went from Jennifer's face down to her outstretched arm and to his sidearm. His elbows unlocked, the tension leaving his shoulders, and he spun the grip towards her. Ma'am.
Very good, Private.
Jennifer put the weapon in her back pocket, turning back to Fenson.
Belay that previous order. Get a clean-up crew down here. Leave Simpson. I'll do the autopsy later. Just...
In here, she looked at the small doors arranged in a grid against one wall.
Put him in the refrigerator until I get back. Ma'am? Rupert?
Fenson nodded towards him. He seemed to be back in shock, shuffling slowly towards Simpson's body. Maybe the lack of sleep was getting to them all. She'd known Simpson, not well, but well enough to nod at him in the tight corridors of the Texas. A good man. Had a family back on Titan. She played chess with him last week. He was a lousy chess player. The brig. Jennifer rubbed her temples.
Oh, damn it all. This fucking noise. Ma'am, what?
Fenson was interrupted by Rupert. Christ! Fucking Christ! He'd bent down over Simpson's body. He's put the fuses for the fucking extinguisher system into his eyes!
What?
Jennifer looked at Rupert, who pointed at Simpson's head.
Here! His eyes! He's put the fuses in his eyes! His fucking eyes, man!
Jennifer looked at the emergency console on the wall. Sure enough, it hung open, loose cables dangling from it. That explained why the fire suppressant system hadn't come on with the alarm. She was pretty sure losing at chess wouldn't make a man do something like this.
Ma'am?
It was Fenson again.
What noise?
Jennifer turned back to Fenson.
Private, can't you hear it? I can even feel it. Through my feet.
Rupert nodded from his position. All the time. I hear it when I sleep. Fenson looked at both of them, backing towards the door. Her weapon came up.
You're crazy. Both of you. It's you. You've been killing everyone.
Jennifer kept facing Fenson, her hand sliding towards the sidearm in her back pocket.
Private, stay frosty. We can work this thing through. People are dead!
She shouted the last word at Jennifer. The gun trembled in her grip. A small trickle of sweat was making its way down from her hairline. A sound came from behind Jennifer. The moment hung, as if time was taking careful steps not to trip up. Jennifer drew the sidearm from behind her and up in one smooth motion, the weapon level and steady on Fenson's face. Fenson's weapon was pointing at Jennifer, the barrel black and without compromise. Both of them held that pose for as long as a heartbeat. Then Fenson squeezed the trigger, the shock of the shot going past Jennifer's shoulder. She felt the nick of the bullet against her cheek, bright as a hornet's sting. Fenson's head whipped back, her body pinwheeling to the doorframe. Jennifer's eyes focused on the barrel of the sidearm in her hand, smoke making a lazy rise towards the ceiling. Damn. She didn't even remember pulling the trigger. Hadn't felt the pull and buck of the weapon. Just like that, Fenson was gone. Her ears were ringing.
She remembered when she'd been posted as a member of a riot squad. A flash grenade had been let off too close to her, some rookie mistake. The noise had been hot and white, feeling like mercury in her head. That's what this felt like, blood trickling from her ear after her eardrum burst. Jennifer lowered the sidearm, turning to see Rupert lying on the morgue's floor next to Simpson. Finson's bullet had taken him in the throat. He was gone too. She looked at the weapon in her hand. Only 4 days. She was going to need more stims. This has been Sleepless, written by Richard Parry, narrated by Richard Parry. Copyright 2017 by Richard Parry. Production copyright 2020 by Richard Parry.